I had the pleasure of speaking with Mahmoud Shabeeb, aka Moody. Moody is a Toronto-based Palestinian, Jordanian, and Canadian media and communications expert in the humanitarian field. He holds a BA in mass communication and a diploma in French language. In addition to his 15-plus year career, and driven by his Palestinian refugee background on both sides of his family, and the empathy, enthusiasm, and passion he carries, he has spent a significant amount of his life volunteering to support causes around global justice for refugees, equality, LGBTQ plus rights, indigenous peoples' rights, and people living with grief. Moody works for the global nonprofit Nonviolent Peace Force as their global media advisor. In this episode, we discuss the situation in Palestine, unpack narratives, and explore a way forward. This is just the start of what easily could have been a several-hour conversation. Moody and I will probably do a part 2 sometime in the future. I hope so, at least. If you like this conversation, make sure to give the video a like, drop a comment or a question you'd want me to cover in a future video, and subscribe for more. Now, my conversation with Moody. Moody, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mike, for having me. So, my name is Mahmoud Shabeeb. I go by Moody, and yeah, my pronouns are he, him. I'm a Palestinian, Jordanian, Canadian. I was born in Jerusalem, grew up in Jordan, lived there most of my life before moving to Canada in early 2020, just before COVID. And I work in the nonprofit sector with the organization, currently with the organization Nonviolent Peace Force, NP. And I do media globally for the organization. That's my discipline, my background. To share a little bit about my background and my personal connection to what we're going to dive in today. Like I mentioned, I am Palestinian. Both my parents were Palestinian refugees from 48 and 67 respectively. And, you know, although I haven't been a refugee myself, luckily, and have had, fortunately, a good life for the most part, the generational trauma lives on, and it's what I grew up with, and it's something that Palestinians in the diaspora all around the world, there's almost 12 or 13 million of us now, and we all live with that generational trauma, and maybe not an identity crisis as much as a constant ongoing reckoning with that identity our entire lives. And yeah, I'm no exception to that.
Yeah. I've heard that exactly what you said towards the end of, from other Palestinians talking about their personal identity, their identity as seen by others, their place in the world, how they identify themselves. Some Palestinians have talked about how they didn't always identify as a Palestinian living in the diaspora for many years, and what that looks like for every person is their own individual kind of journey, I would say. But I think it's interesting when you're talking about the intergenerational trauma and what that does to, people, again, like on the individual and community level, but then also at the wider, like, collective level. And so before we get into, intergenerational trauma and everything, I'm just curious what brought you to Canada in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, that's a longer conversation, but basically, I think I came here for a visit in 2015 because I have family here, and it was for a wedding. I came on a tourist visa, not thinking about immigrating here. I spent a month here, and for some reason, I connected with the place, with the people, a lot more than I had for most of my life in Jordan for some odd reason, or maybe not so odd. And I remember calling my cousin at the airport, just, about to leave on my plane when I was just waiting to board. And I was like, hey, Nancy, I just wanted to tell you, I think I'm gonna come back and make this place home. And she said, she lived in Toronto at the time where I live now, and now she lives in Ottawa. And she was like, I actually knew you would say that. I was just waiting for you to say it. And
That's
lo
so
and behold,
funny.
yeah, lo and behold, that's what happened. And I think it's to try to put it succinctly, it comes from a place of not knowing what you miss until you experience it. I owe a lot to Jordan. grew up there, went to school there, got my education there, built my life there first. And I didn't come, like I said, I've never been a refugee. So it's not that I came here as a refugee. I actually had a very easy immigration route. And I think that also helped make me move to Canada and make it home. So I went through what is called skilled immigration or skilled immigrant process. And yeah, had my job, my bank account, my career, my life. Not saying it was an easy piece of cake, but I would, if time was to go back, I would do it all over again because Canada is not without its problems, and there are so many parallels to draw with the Palestinian struggle versus the indigenous struggle here in
For sure.
Canada, same as in the United States. But that has been part of the beauty of and uniqueness of my journey here in Canada. I connected with First Nations folks, Indigenous folks from different walks of life, different parts of Turtle Island, and I have learned and continue to learn so much from their survival, from their struggle, from their continuous thriving and generosity and hospitality, and they treat me as one of their own kin, and it just is everything I could ask for, really, and reminds me so much of the hospitality and warmth of my own family members in Palestine and in the West Bank and Jerusalem. So it's like a big puzzle picture where there are so many, or mosaic, where like there are so many small pieces that make the full picture. But yeah, Toronto, or Toronto, like it's called in its indigenous name, is home in a way that no home has ever been.
That's great. I hope that most people will be able to find that kind of semblance of peace for wherever they end up, living. I think that's great.
And it's
Um,
it's if I actually may add something, it's never ideal. It's far from ideal. I still get, whether it's on social media, and sometimes for not saying anything controversial other than just literally, you see my picture and you feel like, oh, he looks like he doesn't belong here because he's not white. And even in places where I don't use my actual full name, and I'll be yelled at, go back where you came from, leave my country. And I can say with so much confidence to them, and that's what I do. If I engage, I try not to engage, but even if I do, I say, this is actually as much my home as it is yours, because neither of us comes from this land. We're both
yeah,
immigrants at different times, different eras, but it's the same thing. And I feel so welcome by most people, but people who welcome me the most, again, are the indigenous community, First Nations of the land. So if those people tell me that I am one of them and that I am home and that I am family to them, then who is to say that I am not and that this is not my home? So it's something that, and we will likely dive a little bit deeper into this, but it's something that a lot of Palestinians have to carry with them. There's a lot of that reckoning. And, Jordan is a country not without its problems. And sadly, I grew up with that sort of subtle and sometimes not so subtle discrimination of, if you're of Palestinian descent, if your family came to Jordan after 1948, if they came before 1948, they're just Jordanian. But if they came after 1948, then they're Palestinian. They will never be Jordanian enough. Again, not everyone, obviously, but this is a narrative that growing up in Jordan, where more than 70% of the population is of Palestinian origin post 1948. And so we all grow up with that narrative, sadly. And I'm pretty sure if anyone from Jordan watches or listens to this interview, they will not be able to deny it. So it's something that helped me, I think, also find home in Toronto, because when you're Palestinian, really, your home is inside of you. Instead of you living in your home, your home lives in you. As corny as that may sound, but it's what we always say as Palestinians, and I am, again, no exception.
yeah. No, and I think it's interesting. I think most people probably don't know the large number, like you said, 70% of the population in Jordan are of Palestinian descent, and many of whom cross that border in 48 and stayed, right? And so I think there's narratives. I think what we'll end up talking about is like all these different narratives that exist. But one of the narratives that comes up sometimes when talking about Jordan, especially, is, well, there's already so many Palestinians there. Why can't they just make that home? And like let the rest of the folks that are in the West Bank, just cross over the border and that'll be it. And I think, with so many of these narratives, and we'll talk about Gaza in a bit, but like it's so much of external decision making on another people's behalf without consulting that people, right? There's just these conversations that happen as if moving pieces on a chessboard and not recognizing that there's the human rights, the human dignity of not just the group of people, but the individuals that you're talking about in the thousands and thousands of people that you're like, yeah, just like, why can't they just do this? It's a wild concept to me. And it's not unique to Palestinians. It's something that happens in many places around the world, but especially to Palestinians.
Especially to Palestinians, and there's that narrative again that like, you're all Arabs, you're all Muslims, which is completely false. And you all speak the same language, you're all the same people. I would argue, Arabs or people living in the Middle East and North Africa, as is named today, we are some of the most diverse groups in the world. And just because our native tongue is pretty much from the same family tree or the same language family, does not mean we're all the same people.
Right.
Your first language is English. Why don't you move to England and live there and give New York or the US back to its indigenous people, or give it to a different group of people or whatever? Like, I think putting things into perspective is very important, and people who make those claims either lack that perspective or lack the empathy to put themselves in other people's shoes and think, what if it were me? Would I actually agree with that? Would that apply to me in my current identity, language, whatever? I mean, there is a lot of similarities and shared roots and shared cultures, and we connect with each other as Arabic speakers on a different level. But again, we are very diverse. We have lineages and histories and cultures and traditions, and if you don't speak the Arabic language, you might not really understand how different it can be. Like, it differs in Jordan from one village to another, from one town to another. When I go, for instance, to Wadi Rum in the desert in the south of Jordan, the tribal native folks there, when they speak to me, I understand them, but when they speak to each other, they speak Arabic. I don't understand most of what they say. If I go to North Africa, that's a whole other thing. I joke with people often that I'm fluent in Tunisian, very random. I've never even been to Tunisia, but I love languages and I love pick them up. And I tell people it's like being Spanish and being fluent in Italian, for instance.
Yep.
Completely different language. There are even certain different rules when it comes to like Tunisian Arabic versus Palestinian Arabic. In my own home, and this is something very common for Palestinian Jordanians or Palestinians in the diaspora, our dialect is very fluid and flexible, and so we pick words a lot from Lebanese and Egyptian and Syrian and Gulf countries and Iraqi. So sometimes we have more synonyms than others, but then also inside our own household, you might hear differences if you understand the language between how I speak, how my dad speaks, how my brother speaks, how my sister speaks. So again, we have that very rich diversity, which is, I think, much more of a blessing than it is a curse, by far. But at the same time, you can't just divide and conquer, and this is just a colonial, not even neo-colonial, it's just a colonial narrative. Oh, you know what? You are more similar to Jordanians than you are to Israelis. Yeah, you know what? Because actually it used to be all one open land. People were from Salt in Jordan and worked in Jerusalem. You had Lebanese people who worked in Jaffa or Haifa and crossed the border back and forth more often than not. You see that in Europe
Right.
today. There are
For
many
sure.
colleagues of mine who work in Geneva, live in France because it's cheaper, and cross the border every day back and forth. So why don't they just stay in Geneva, or why
Yep.
don't the Swiss French stay in France and give Geneva to, I don't know, you know what I mean? So
For
there's
sure. And I think
again,
so much of it comes down to like these borders that are in many ways artificially drawn,
100%.
by somebody at some point, whether that's a more recent border, like South Sudan is the world's newest country, like created a
Yeah.
new border like on the map, or like historically colonial, maps that are drawn up. I mean, in so many places, talk about this with my students a lot, especially in Africa, but not exclusively.
Yeah.
There are so many borders that were drawn with no care to who the people were or anything. It was just
Many of them
for,
were drawn on a map on paper in Europe without even
yeah,
knowing anything about the land, which is just
no.
absurd. But
And
that
so
is
you
the
have people
reality of where
that,
we live in.
whether it's religious, whether it's language, whether it's cultural, that like literally right across a border do share a lot more in common because they actually are more closely related. But because of this new border that was drawn, they're in two different countries with two very different things. And it's not so dissimilar in some ways. It's a little bit more like a bastardized example, but like in the United States, what we're currently dealing with is like this idea of gerrymandering, right? Like drawing out congressional maps to put certain people in certain districts. And some
And
of
that's
that
how
is
it
very
starts
political.
in
Yeah,
some ways.
exactly. Yeah, and I think something that you were talking about too, with the idea of a people being similar to each other, sharing a language or sharing a religion or whatever else. But I think there's also a huge difference between people and governments, and that's another like concept when you think about quote unquote like the Arab world. A lot of decisions that are made, sometimes even by governments of different entities, it's not necessarily in the best interest of the people. you
Never.
know it Yeah, right. And so even if you could say like, oh well, you're closer to this, or like the governments that are in charge, their the decisions that they're making often are not in the interest of another people in another country for their best interest. It's for
Totally.
a variety of other reasons.
Totally. Totally. And I mean, I think issues like, for instance, gerrymandering and whatnot are probably remnants of colonial practices. I'm not an expert on voting or elections, but a lot of this we still continue to experience. Like there's something you mentioned before while we were preparing this conversation, which is the issue of the yellow lines right now in Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yep.
Israel just keeps moving around, like you said earlier, like pieces on a chessboard, and then
Yeah, so now the new yellow line, for people who don't know, is this new border that is being drawn up by Israel as part of this sort of quote unquote ceasefire arrangement. And if you look at a map of Gaza, Israel has basically taken over 60% of the entire strip, is now considered part of Israel by, unofficially but officially. And we'll see how that plays out. But when you look at how small the strip was originally, and now it's even shrunk, drastically, including cutting out major cities. What does that mean for the future of the people?
to put things into perspective, and this is, as a media expert, this is something I always encourage spokespeople to do, which is compare it to something, visualize, or how do you say this? Like that people can visualize. So in this case, the entire Gaza Strip, which consists of multiple different cities, multiple governorates, is half the size of New York City with its five boroughs. So not Manhattan, but what New York City consists of. And even before, the current full-scale genocide, Gaza was the world's largest open-air prison. More than 2.1 million, 2.2 million people lived in that very small space and landmass, with some of the world's highest unemployment rates. 97% of the drinking water was polluted at any day. It was really hard have access to very basic needs like water, for instance. And it
And,
was
and just to
fully
pause quickly, because I think the phrase open air prison is so important because people don't fully understand sometimes that Palestinians that were living in Gaza don't have freedom of movement,
at all,
right? And
at all.
right.
And we're talking
So,
about, so I was going to go back a little bit in history. So in 2005, up to 2005, Israel had illegal settlements in Gaza like they do in the West Bank now, and we'll talk a lot about the issue of the West Bank. But there were some of these illegal settlements, and then there was an agreement by which Israel pulled out and dismantled those settlements. So they can do that if they want to. They have the
right.
will. They can do that in one day. It's not an issue of the logistics of it all, but. Immediately, as soon as they pulled out, or just soon after, they placed a full blockade on everyone in Gaza. That means people had no longer any freedom. It's not like they had great freedom before. I mean, look at the West Bank. But again, they had full blockade on land crossing, and this is an agreement also, sadly, with Egypt because of Israel's influence and regional power and pressure backed by the United States and the West. No air movement. Gaza used to have an airport before 67 that was functional, and sadly hasn't been since because Israel is not allowing them to make it functional, and it's just been standing idle, but sadly has become, with it being derelict already, it has become dysfunctional with genocide and the bombing, and they're not allowed to, even though Gaza has you know relatively long coastline. Palestinians are not allowed to travel by sea either. I mean, even fishermen there, and fishing is one of the main sources of income in Gaza. They have had restrictions of movement for the 2 decades up till now, from when the blockade started until now. Israel moved the lines, the water borders, if you will, for Palestinian fishermen, kept encroaching closer and closer and taking away the spots that were more sort of fertile or had more fish in the sea per se, and
Yeah,
made it
for all
hard.
intents and purposes, like Israel treats the water access, the coastal like borders as their own, and controls
100%.
that through a naval blockade versus what should be freedom of passage for Gazans or others in and
100%.
out of Gaza based on that coastline.
100%. And I mean, it saddens me and frustrates me when people treat all of this as it started on October 7th, 2023, when we all know deep down that that's not, and sometimes not very deep down, like it's very out there in public. There is no dearth of information on what Israel has been doing to Palestinians for decades and decades up to October 7th, 23. And so it's important to treat that as a reaction more than an action. And whatever your stance is on Hamas or on October 7th, it's important to never take that out of context.
Yeah.
History did not begin to exist on October the 7th. In fact, there were multiple attacks that were recorded on Gaza by Israel in just that week, the first week of October 23, prior to October 7th at 6 a.m. when it all started. So I just encourage people watching and listening to this interview. It's okay if you have some, if you're twitching listening to this, and if it makes you feel uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable sometimes is important. Do your research, please. Read about the Nakba, read about the full blockade on Gaza, read about the constant breaches of human rights that Israel has been doing against Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza and in Jerusalem, and against Palestinians within Israel who live as Israeli citizens every single day since 1948, and even before, because there were a lot
Yeah.
of organized attacks and shootings and bombings even prior to that. So it's
Well, and I would
important
just
to
say, I
keep
think
all that.
your point you just made about like doing the research and knowing about these things, like I will admit, like as somebody, so my background is Jewish, my family's Jewish, but as we've talked about, like nobody in my family was ever a Zionist. Like we never really talked about Israel. Like it existed in the ether, like you knew about Israel, but like there was never like we never had a desire to go
A
to Israel.
direct
It wasn't like a
connection.
thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
like I have no family in Israel, and it wasn't until adulthood that I learned the term Nakba. Like the term just never crossed into anything that I did,
Yeah,
including during my studies of, genocide, mass atrocities, human rights, all these other things. And I think just even that, I forget who said it. I need to find out who this person was so I can give them credit. But one of the best things I ever heard about the Israel-Palestine situation is it matters when you start the clock, right? So like people will often be like, well, this thing happened. It's like, yes, but what happened before that? What happened before? And all of a sudden you can go back, decades. But so often, so much of what we're talking about is very current temporally. But I
100%.
think for so much of this, like it goes back to, to some degree what you were talking about at the beginning of collective trauma and generational trauma, but also just how narratives are shaped, right? And I've often thought about how, because you made analogies between Canada and the situation in the region and the U.S. and the history of colonialism and everything. I think it's so interesting because in the United States, at least, when you're growing up, you grow up with a very clear narrative of what the U.S. did to establish the United States. And
Yes, a lot.
you learn a little bit about, the quote unquote kind of like ill treatment of Native Americans, but you don't learn about it as a genocide, right? It's always explained to you, not explicitly, but implicitly, like, yes, some bad things happened to a lot of people that lived here, but it was necessary in order to start the United States. And I feel as though for many people that, especially in the Jewish community in the United States, that's the narrative that you grow up with about Israel is yes, there were some people there and yes, like things weren't so good, but they attacked us and we had to then fight. And it's also a weird thing to say us because like, again, many people that are Jewish and American aren't Israeli. Like there is
Yeah.
this like difference.
And
Um,
it actually makes the current government in Israel very angry that there are still more Jewish people in the United States than there are in Israel by numbers because
yeah,
they want to shift that balance. I want to go back just for a second to talking about Nakba. I didn't want to seem distracted by my phone, but I was looking into, so I'll just show this. I don't know if the camera can capture it. No,
maybe
sadly it
not.
can't.
You can send me the image. I can upload it.
Yeah, so this is an app called iReturn. I was looking, I think it's the same app that was called iNakba before. Now it's called iReturn. It shows you if you really want to learn what Nakba is and what happened to Palestinians, and that's why I was digging it up. You can download it and it's kind of interactive. You can zoom in on every village that Israel destroyed by 1948, and there is up to 400 Palestinian villages. My dad's family comes from Ain Karim, which continues to exist today as one of the outskirts of West Jerusalem. So I don't have access to it, but my grandfather's house still stands as it is because it was built of like very fine, highly refined stone, and the Jewish family that settled in from Iraq just expanded a little bit, made some renovations, but it's really standing as it was before 48. But in the case of many other Palestinians, sadly, that wasn't the case because their villages were completely destroyed. And there's so much greenwashing that Israel has done since, in that a lot of these villages, to support the narrative that Israel was established on about, making the desert bloom and a land without people for a people without land, which is all completely false. None of
Yep.
that is true. It's not even inaccurate. It's 100% false. It's just lies. And if you look again, all this information exists. There's so much data and archives that Israel is trying to destroy actively because they don't want it to exist. But this is the beauty of being in a digital world where it's almost impossible to make
Yep.
information disappear. So this app, iReturn, is an excellent example. You can download it, and it has pictures of a lot of these villages before 1948, pictures of how they were destroyed and what happened after, data, numbers, how many people were there and were expelled, and so on, all the way from the Ras Al Naqoura border with Lebanon to Rashrash traditionally, which is now called Eilat, the coastal port on the Red Sea, and everything in between, in the Negev, and all the way to the Mediterranean throughout, and the Mediterranean coastline. So my mom's family is an example of that. They used to come from a village called Abbasiyya outside Jaffa, around where Greater Tel Aviv is today. And sadly, a lot of their land that my grandmother, for instance, owned. And, there's also this narrative of women were oppressed, this, that. It's not true. My grandmother owned swaths of land, and her land was confiscated for the Ben Gurion airport runway, for example. This is one of many stories that I grew up with and that I learned as part of my Palestinian identity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and there's like so many documentaries. We talked about Tentura and a couple others. I mean, there's documentaries of Israelis even speaking about the crimes that were perpetrated by them in the earliest days, as you said, even before 48, but then after as well,
Yeah.
to establish the state, to take over more land, to be able to settle in certain areas that were already settled. And I think even if, and this is what kills me, is like even if you take away that history and you just focus on modern, recent, like last few decades of history, we were talking about the West Bank, the amount of expansion that Israel has done in the West Bank over the last few decades, like just since we've been alive even, is astronomical. And so there's a narrative that exists of the War of Independence versus the Nakba and the history, and the Israelis were like given this land and then they had to fight for it, like kicking people off their lands, ethnic cleansing, genocide. Like there's that whole narrative. But then even if you were able to say like, okay, well, let's not talk about that. Let's just talk about the last 30 years, last 20 years. The maps that are in the West Bank and the amount of people that have been pushed off their land, including today, like it's happening right now. It's not like this is
Happening
history, right? This
actively
is
as we speak, 100%.
exactly. So, and I think that's really important. And one thing I just want to say is, there's this term settlers and settlements. And this took me, years to learn too, because it's something that like, you just hear. For many people, you hear this term and in your mind, you think people are like planting a flag in a piece of land that nobody's living on and being like, well, now we're going to like call this Israel and we're going to set up some tents and like occupy the space, kind of like the Occupy protests on college campuses. Many of these settlements, quote unquote settlements, are full cities, fully functioning, like gated communities, gorgeous, built up, fully roads and buildings and baseball fields.
A lot of them
And
farmland, fertile farmland.
for
That
sure,
they
yeah,
target on purpose. Also, to show you in that backdrop, when they put these pictures, they will make sure to angle it in a way that just shows you empty land. It's not empty land. These are
right,
farms that people cultivate and live on, and
yep,
they used to sell and export their produce. And Israel, when I mean, the UN maps in 47 whatnot were drawn, and Israel took even a lot more than what the unfair, uneven
for
UN
sure.
plan had allocated land to Israel. Their focus was on the most fertile land in Palestine, as well as the land with the best sea access, the best trade routes and whatnot.
Yep.
So this continues to happen now in the West Bank. They're like, and this happened. If you think back again on the United States and Turtle Island's history, you probably know better than I do about the history of Oklahoma and the death routes that indigenous people were expelled to Oklahoma from all the way from Florida, thousands
Yep.
of miles, and many of them died on the way. And then when the European settlers were like, "Oh my God, Oklahoma has a lot of zinc and has a lot of this and has a lot of
And
that
oil.
and oil. You know what? We will kick you out even further." And
Hmm.
this has been replicated in South Africa, textbook apartheid and genocide of the native people of the land, and then from there taken to Palestine. And like you said, it continues to happen today. So I just happened a couple of weeks ago to watch in a fundraiser the documentary No Other Land that was done between Basil and Olaf. I forgot his name, Yuval.
Yuval. Yep.
Yeah, Israeli from or living in Beersheba or Beer Saba in Arabic. And I had known everything about it. I had known everything about the facts they're sharing, but just seeing these stories, I cried my eyes out throughout the whole
Yeah.
thing. I could not stop crying, no matter how hard I tried. And everyone that was with me, we left with there, like the air was so heavy. There was just so much, like we were all weighed down because it's just you feel helpless when you watch that. And not everyone there was Palestinian or Arab or Muslim, of course.
Yep.
My friend that came to watch it with me is Chinese, and people from all backgrounds are interested in learning more about that. So, like you said, I mean, Israel is not even hiding it anymore. They used to sugarcoat their plans. They're saying it out loud now. They are showing the map of Greater Israel. They talk about it. It takes over all of Jordan, all of Lebanon, big parts of Syria, parts of Egypt, big parts of Saudi Arabia, even all the way to Turkey. I think parts of Iraq. It's like they're not even lying about it. They're not hiding it anymore. They're not
And it
saying
all goes back
something.
to biblical, text, right? It all goes back to what is supposedly written in the Torah of like what quote unquote Israel is, and then applying that to this current map situation that we have today, which we already talked about borders and what they mean. But yeah, it's crazy that there are actually some people that believe that one day that will be the reality, that Israel will end up taking the space of all those other countries. But yeah, just going
And
back
there's so
to
much to
North.
dissect there that I would love to dive deeper in. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say just going back to the Northern land because I think it's important.
Yeah.
I showed it to my students, and I had a couple of students who were Palestinian, and there was like a balance of some of them wish there was more narrative and there was more like background for like people to like understand, but then there's also recognition of like this the very human element of that story and like showing in real time what's happening. I think for people who don't fully get it, and Northern does a good job of this, showing Israeli military coming into towns, villages, cities, and just demolishing homes, to pouring concrete into water wells, kicking pellets, like making it uninhabitable for people in the areas that they live, and sometimes
Even
doing
killing
it
cattle, killing pigeons, killing chickens, just because, yeah.
right. Yeah, and sometimes doing it with this narrative of, as it is in no other land, like we're now establishing this as a military zone, right? Like so it's like a government proxy of saying, well, the military needs this for it was like testing or
Drills and
like
yeah, yeah.
drills, yeah. And then in other cases, they're just like, well, you never got a permit for this building, and so we're going to take it down. But then the government doesn't allow for Palestinians to get permits ever, pretty much. So everything that they're building is illegal. And I think one of the hardest things in that film for me, in addition to the unending violence that Palestinians see from citizens and like just being able to be shot and have nobody be held accountable for this, which happens all too frequently. But one of the hardest things was the moment that the Israelis, the military move off, and the first thing that the Palestinians do is try to get what little tools they have because they're going to rebuild. And there's just like this
And the women
mentality
building
of,
during the day, the women and children, the men building during the night, finding ways
yep,
to extend electricity. One question I heard from people over is like, oh my God, how could they even, uh, you know, empower, like put power in the caves that they moved into?
yep,
Because it's just like, how, where do you get that from? But when there is a will, there is a way. And
for sure.
when that's been your land for decades, and mind you, it's so important to keep in mind that a lot of these people were refugees who were kicked out of their homes in 1948, and
Yep.
then the local indigenous community who had lived there for centuries, if not more, welcomed them, and they became one community. But that's the Palestinian kinship, and that's survival for you. And then
Yep.
using that as an excuse to say, you appropriated this land illegally. This is Israelis having the audacity to say that to Palestinians. You don't have the building permit, you this, you that. But I mean, it's the name of the film, No Other Land, comes from this old lady who says, they want to kick us out. Where do they want us to go? We have no other land.
Right.
And that's exactly the concept, or that's the premise of what we're seeing today in Gaza. People in Gaza, more than 80% of them, I believe, come from other parts of Palestine. And it's so sad to think I ended up being one of the lucky ones just because my parents, in the blink of an eye, had to decide, or their families had to decide in which direction to flee. If you fled to Lebanon, you're just stuck in limbo since then as a refugee. If you
Right.
fled to Gaza, your family is now, encroached upon and genocided actively. It's just unfathomable. And so these people have nowhere else to go, and they are so tired after decades and generations of being continuously displaced and not having a home to I mean, I managed to build a life in Toronto, but I had all the right means for it. And I'll still
Right.
tell you, it's never an easy thing to uproot yourself and your entire life and move elsewhere.
For sure.
Imagine having everything taken away from you and destroyed and your own family killed. Maybe you're even maimed and you lose a limb or limbs, and then you're told, now Indonesia is going to be your home, or South Sudan, or whatever Israel is
Yeah.
telling Palestinians. Of course, they're resisting against that. Of course, they don't want that to happen again. Of course, they know that is not going to bring them peace or end their suffering. If anything, it's the contrary.
Yeah. No, and I always say, resilience is like this superpower that humans have that we should never need to use, but we
Yes.
do. And I've always been amazed, whether I've been in, refugee camps or IDP camps or, seeing like super impoverished people in various places, like the resiliency of especially like children. And you see this now in Gaza. Like there was a photo or a video that was going around, totally bombed out. Looks like, a post-apocalyptic world. I mean, it looks like every horrible image you would see from videos. And then there's kids playing on like a makeshift swing. And there's like this, it like chokes me up. Like there's this ability for people to be able to figure out a way forward amidst like literally the worst situations possible. And I think it's just so horrible to think about that there are people that are still today justifying everything that is being done and finding ways to do it. And it doesn't even make sense to me. Like I saw a post the other day where this woman, I don't even know who she was, but was basically saying it's not genocide in Gaza, right? It's not genocide because of this, because of that, whatever. Then she went a step further and said there are still then people who would say, even if they agree it's not just, they'll still say that Israel did something wrong. They didn't do anything wrong because they were defending Israel. And like, it's just, it's insane to me. I've had this conversation with so many people. Like genocide obviously has a very specific term, intent to destroy in whole or in part ethnic, national, racial, or religious group, from the 1948 convention. But war crimes and crimes against humanity are much wider.
Yeah.
And for people to not even be able to admit that by bombing pretty much everywhere in Gaza, I mean, it was something, what, like 70% of the structures were either destroyed or severely damaged.
Probably
I mean,
more, yeah.
yeah, like in any other context, if a government did that, I mean, literally, our own government was calling what Russia was doing in Ukraine war crimes and crimes against humanity very early on, and there was way less destruction that was happening from that war.
And
And
like rightly so. I mean, I have been to Ukraine for work. I have the Ukrainian flag here, and I have Ukrainian friends. And much like Palestinians and especially Palestinians in Gaza, they do say we are tired of being resilient. We are tired of being strong. We don't want to be strong. And yes, what Russia is doing in Ukraine obviously is crimes against humanity. It's occupation. It's despicable to say the least. But why do we have these double standards in the
yeah,
U.S. and in the West? And I am very proud and in a way honored as a Palestinian to see every day many more people standing up for Palestine. I have like some stickers of the Palestinian flag and the kufiya at my front door. And last night someone was trying to unlock my door and I opened it. It was by mistake. The parents of my neighbor who just moved in next door a week ago, and the mother was like, "I'm sorry, that was by mistake." And then they introduced themselves. I introduced myself, and the father of my neighbor shook my hands, and then he said, "I really like your sticker," and just moved on. So it's like these small sort of,
yeah,
you know, small pieces, small gestures of solidarity. They really make a big difference in our
yeah,
day-to-day life. Um, but for me, I think something, especially for your audience, I suspect a lot of them will be American. I think Americans, I often say this, I think I might have said it to you, and I say it a lot to my American colleagues and friends. Americans often don't understand the magnitude of the power they have as
Yeah.
citizens and as even as civilians. I'm not talking about the US Army or foreign policy. Your taxes are funding this, and Americans deserve to have sufficient healthcare and cheaper tuition and access to education. The US has some of the world's best medical findings and medical establishments, and some of the world's, I think, like often when you look at the top 10 universities in the world, seven, eight of them are in the United States, but then you guys have the highest, disproportionately highest tuition fees in the world. And when you think about how much money the US has given to Israel in the form of weaponry to destroy, again, the land mass or land size that is the size of half the size of New York City. And you talk about what, 20, 25 billion US dollars. Just try to put that into perspective of
Yeah. And you mean just in the last 2 years?
in the
Like
last 2 years
I want to
only.
be very clear to people. Like when he's saying 20, 25 million, like billion,
Only in the
that's
last
just
two
in the
years,
last couple of years.
which is unfathomable. And up to that point, the U.S. had been steadily giving up to 4 billion, sometimes more than
Yep.
$4 billion to Israel. And we're only again talking about military support. We're not talking about
Right.
economic subsidies and grants and which are I don't even have the numbers, and they are so
Yeah.
much more. So, as the average American, imagine taking all of that and investing it in your home, in, you know, something as basic as if you make the mistake of developing cancer, you don't have to end up on the street. You can actually have a country that makes you or allows you as a citizen to maintain your dignity and receive the treatment you deserve, which again, the US does not have a shortage of that. You guys have
Right.
all the most developed medical, like a lot more than Canada or anywhere else in the world, really, findings and establishments and doctors and infrastructure. But it's just so expensive and unaffordable for the average American. And all of that, we talk about billionaires, and that is very important. We talk about capitalistic greed, etc. But Israel comes into play as part of this issue economically
For sure.
for Americans as a fundamental part and as something that needs to be addressed head on, because it's really it should be something that goes without saying, and that
Yeah.
people should think of firsthand, like, why am I footing the bill for the killing and destruction and dismantling of another population that belongs to the land, and the majority of them are children and civilians.
Yeah, and it's a wild concept, and obviously these narratives are changing a little bit
Yeah.
because even the Israeli government has recognized that they're losing the American Jewish people. Like the polls year after year, they're
100%.
losing, especially like more liberal, progressive, younger Jews, and so they're like tripling down on the right, the Christian nationalists, these folks that are Christian Zionists, because they know that they can tap into that
Yeah.
ideology, which is
Even,
so
even some of
based.
the Christian Zionists, who would have thought that Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene would like change their narrative 100%, like
Yeah.
180 degrees, Joe Rogan, etc. Like, you hear names and you're like, never in my life would I have imagined this person to turn against the Zionist dream and Zionism. And I'm glad you brought up Christian Zionism, because going back to the greater Israel dream and all this sort of mythical theology, excuse me, and it's obviously false historically. There's no proof on all of this having ever been greater Israel. And even if it's absurd to talk about something that's impossible to measure from 3,500 years ago and say, I have the right to Aliyah, and this is me just going back to my homeland. Where were my ancestors 3,000 years ago? What were your ancestors 3,000 years ago? How would it even be possible to know
Yeah.
exactly what that is? But again, that goes back to the same ideology of using religion to justify
For
genocide
sure.
and to justify ethnic cleansing. So you talk about Aliyah on one hand, it's like talking about the pilgrims and the pilgrimage on the Mayflower and the European settlers, the Christian fanatics using that as an excuse to move to the US or to the New World back then, because this is what God destined to them to bring people to the light under Christianity and whatnot. So it's like, again, using religion over and over and over to justify the ends, which is obviously anyone with any conscience would say it's plainly wrong, to put it
Yeah,
mildly.
and it's so dangerous. I mean, for obviously generations, going back centuries, I've always thought about this. It's like when you justify something based on religion, whether that is today, denying LGBTQ people equal rights, or that's, talking about the areas in Israel or, the areas of the US and, why you need to hold black people as slaves. I mean, there's so many different narratives that were justified by religion. But
100%.
it's almost impossible to then argue with people because their firm belief, maybe or maybe not, because some people use it to their advantage and maybe they don't actually believe it, but they basically are saying, well, God told me to do this, God commanded this. And so there's like, that cuts the argument off. Like, you can't have a conversation with them beyond that because they fundamentally believe, or say they do, that it's a commandment from God to be doing whatever they're saying, or to be doing whatever they're doing. And I think, it's obviously like the Christian Zionists, it's an interesting, dynamic there, because you have people that want to see Jews go back to Israel so that one day there will be the revelation and everything else, and then all those Jews will end up being killed and sent to hell because they're not Christian. And so it's like this weird narrative that there's this, short-term, partnership between some Jews and these, Christian Zionists,
So someone
but
described it
don't have the
aptly.
long-term goals. Like, they don't.
Someone described it aptly as an uncomfortable, manipulative exchange
Yeah.
of interests, which is
Yep.
exactly what it is. The fanatic Jews, the fanatic Christians, we will kill you later, but right now we need to be united in order to get to that stage.
Right. Yeah. It's really wild. But I think, and when we talk about the funding that the U.S. and, like you said, the U.S. citizens, I think for so many years there's been this narrative, and you still hear, especially Republicans say this, but Joe Biden also would say things like this
Yeah,
too,
100%.
that Israel exists like for the U.S. interest.
Totally.
And he would say famously multiple times, like, if Israel didn't exist, we would need to
We
create
would
an
create an
Israel.
Israel, 100%.
Exactly. And you see people like Lindsey Graham basically talk about, well, Israel's doing all the fighting for us. Like, yeah, send them more billions because we don't have to do it.
Yeah.
And there's this missing narrative, and it's similar to, I think I mentioned this to you before, somebody that I know posted on Facebook after Mamdani won in New York, that, New York will no longer be safe for Jews and people should come to stay with her in Israel, and all this stuff. And there's this weird narrative because as an somebody who identifies as Jewish, as an American, many of my friends that are in the same kind of like sphere as me, we feel the most unsafe when Israel is doing bad things. Like,
Million percent.
anti-Semitism gets ratcheted up around the world when Israel is doing something bad, because like, I have nothing to do with what Israel is doing. Like, I don't support,
Exactly.
I'm not Israeli citizen, whatever. But because of the connection between being Jewish, then people start to hate Jews more broadly. So that's one element of it. The second element of it is this like national security component, which again, many of the reasons why there's insecurity regionally against Israel is because of Israel's negative engagements elsewhere. And there is a give and take there, because, especially like some of the extremists, and again, I think this goes back to like people that are in charge, right? There's a very big difference between the
Absolutely.
extremists that are in government and the average citizen.
Absolutely.
But the extremists in Iran, like, much of the reasoning for supporting various different elements is because of Israel. And so, like, even if that was the case, if Israel, not that I'm advocating for this necessarily, but like, if Israel did not exist, would there be the same problems in this region that the U.S. would think of as national security concerns?
Great question, and the short answer is absolutely not.
Yeah,
And it's, I mean, again, without digressing too much, but there is so much that goes into play because of the arms lobbying and arms
for
manufacturers who
sure.
need the
And these
world.
AI companies now. I mean,
Now AI, I think the conversation I've had the most this week has been data centers that are just going up in all places around the world like the plague. It's insane. It's like
Yep.
parasites just spreading and the
No, but even the AI companies, like you said, these defense contractors getting rich off of the violence in
exactly.
Gaza, but it's also like testing new things, and so you have Palantir and
Exactly.
others that are like testing for the
And
first
that's how
time.
Israel has been winning, like contracts
Yeah.
for exporting arms because they are tested. And when
Yep.
we say tested, it's most of it is not even in Gaza, obviously not even against Iran or whatever. A lot of it has been in the West Bank.
For sure.
Children going home from school carrying backpacks in
Yep.
Hebron being targeted by these automatic AI powered cameras or killer drones and whatnot. And a lot of them just facing their demise on their way back to school. We're talking about single digit children, we're talking about very young people. A settler implanting a weapon or even sometimes, sorry, a knife or even a rock sometimes in a kid's backpack, or an Israeli soldier stopping the kid. Again, we're talking about Hebron, Khalil, to search their bag and implanting something in it to justify then saying this is what happened, and then promoting and selling these methods globally. I mean, even without digressing too much, when if you go back to when the conservatorship, the infamous conservatorship on Britney Spears, fell through. There's a lot of digging that took place and findings that the surveillance her dad was using against her was very developed and very invasive, and it was
Yeah.
all developed by an Israeli company. So you have things like that that people take and use for like all sorts of malignant purposes in
For
different
sure.
sectors, in different backgrounds, in different climates. And then again, at the end of the day, who wins and who makes the money and profits from all of this is the weapons company. So this is a large component of it. And you know better than I do that the weapons and like arms lobbying in the United States is just so rampant and
Yep.
big in a way that is out of control. And I believe when Joe Biden and Lindsey Graham talk about the importance, the strategic importance of Israel in the Middle East, that's what they mean, even if they don't say it outright, because they don't
Yeah.
want the average American citizen or citizen of the world to catch up on that. But it's the writing's on the wall, and we can all see it and understand and identify it for what it really is.
Yeah. And I'll say one more thing, and then let's pivot to something else. But I think there is this challenge that we have, especially in the U.S., where there is I don't always like this term because I don't think it reflects the age necessarily, but like the old guard, right? And this old guard mentality of what America's place in the world is, what security looks like, how do you bring peace to the world, et cetera. And you're seeing this play out a lot with this Trump narrative of peace through strength, and oh, I'm going to be the peace president, and we're going to end all these wars, but we're also going to invade Venezuela. Like there's this wild narrative, and there is like in some ways this generational difference, and I do hope that more people as they retire from Congress and more younger people are getting into Congress with a different mentality, having grown up in the age of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, having grown up in the age of the genocide in Gaza, and having grown up in these different spaces, have a different viewpoint. But it is a challenge because yes, obviously the lobbyists are a big part of the problem, but there are just people that are in government at various levels, whether it's in the administration or in Congress, that deeply believe the things that they're doing is right. And doesn't matter how many people die, doesn't matter how many countries they invade, doesn't matter how many national or international laws they violate, they believe they're right. And
Yeah.
so it's a big challenge.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do want to pivot though because we're coming up to almost an hour now, and we could talk forever. But would love to just talk about the current state of play in both Gaza and the West Bank, and what you think is coming down the pike. I think I don't know that we have time to get into all the nitty gritty of the quote unquote ceasefire peace plan, whatever you want to call it, in Gaza that does not really exist. But also in the West Bank, I think what's been left out of the narrative, with so much focus on Gaza for a good reason, is that, as we said before, Israel has continuously expanded settlements in the West Bank. And, talking about the U.S., again, like, this is a bipartisan issue, right? Like, even President Obama, who was not a fan of Bibi Netanyahu, was not a fan of expansion of settlements, continued to send money year over year in the tune of, like you said before, 4 billion or so a year, knowing that it wasn't making any like, and what's his name, Ben Rhodes recently was talking about, he was a former advisor to Obama, now was one of the podcast
Yeah.
Pod Save America guys. He was talking about how there was this hug BB mentality of like, well, we need to show him that we still love Israel and we'll give the fund, and then maybe like he'll listen. And it's just
And
been proven
I love
out.
how Americans reacted to that because
Yeah,
the most sort of rightly aggressive reactions against that came from Americans, and I was really, pleased and in a weird way reassured, if you will,
yeah,
to see those reactions because these are the kind of reactions you probably wouldn't have seen 10 years ago, and
right.
this is how change comes about.
For sure. Yeah, and I think that's the thing too, is when you think about Israeli politics even, I don't know the exact numbers, but like Netanyahu has been in power in some way, shape, or form, or influencing, for the last 30 years or so, right?
100%.
He was
Yeah,
first prime minister in the 90s, right?
true.
So, and obviously, like, he wasn't prime minister this whole time. It's not like he's a dictator
But
that's
he never
never left
faded out.
office.
His
Right,
influence
exactly. His,
was
his
never, yeah.
influence, yeah. And so I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle. I mentioned it before, like when you have extremists that are in power, whether that's extremists here at home in the U.S., extremists that are in, Israel, extremists that are in, leadership of Hamas. It doesn't matter. The extremists never have the interests of the people writ large at hand. And, I do think there are a growing number of people, and it's like a push and pull, right? Because you have Israelis that live in Israel that would argue and support an idea of a two-state solution and self-determination and finding a way to have Palestinians get basic human rights, and then October 7th happens, and those people that were even further to the left than most people would be get pulled back to the right, and then you have people in the States where maybe for years we're supporting Israel, and then everything since October 7th happens in Gaza, and then they get pushed further to the left of, well, Israel, can't be supported if they're going to commit, widespread genocide.
Yeah.
And so, like, I don't know how we get out of this situation where, like, we just need a better path forward
Yeah.
and a wider recognition that the Hug BB mentality and the wider version of that doesn't work. And there's been very little pressure on Israel to, support international law and get out of some of these
Totally.
settlements and, everything else. And so I'm just curious, like, beyond obviously doing the advocacy and the messaging and everything else, like, what you think is coming.
I mean, it's very hard to predict, and it's probably even harder to predict something, that is not bloody and bleak.
Yeah,
I want to start by acknowledging that I don't think, as controversial as that might sound, I don't think Benjamin Netanyahu is the problem. I think he is one big part, one fundamental
for
part of
sure.
the problem. The problem is an ideology. Hitler wasn't the problem on his own. He was part of the Nazi ideology. Nazism was the problem, is the problem,
Yeah,
and what we're seeing in Israel is not very different because there is that supremacy mentality to it, and you see these comparisons being drawn more and more now, even though that was a
yeah.
taboo until a few years ago.
Ben
So
Gavir with his noose pins, and I
exactly,
don't know. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, when you're promoting something like that so openly, like these are the nooses we will hang Palestinians on, but then you have a Knesset that, except for the Palestinian Israeli members, the majority of Jewish Israelis approve the law to execute Palestinian prisoners. You have a Knesset, that for those who might not know, it's, yeah, the Israeli parliament, who a year ago, if you go back, there was this debate, heated debate, and again, heated just because the Palestinian Israelis in the Knesset, who are always being shunned and vilified for being a little bit more moderate, if you will, the rest of the Knesset members were debating what could be the framework that we can put together to legalize inserting a sharp metal object in the rectum of a Palestinian prisoner. And like, it's just so absurd and sort of hard to believe that a debate like that is happening within the confines of the parliament that represents a whole population.
Yep.
So that just gives
Endorsing
you
the
a
expansion, and the full settlement of the West Bank, right?
that's yeah. We're talking
It
about
was a non-binding, I guess, like it wasn't like a law, but the Knesset endorsed the
that,
full
but I mean,
expansion.
like, even when you talk about inserting a sharp metal object in
Yeah, it's
someone's
crazy.
rectum, any human being would just be appalled and horrified to hear that that's a notion. But for the Israeli parliament, it's a discussion that, it's not, it wasn't even about can we or can we not make it legal. It was about what is the legal framework we can put for this. So the argument is
Yeah.
not to make it legal. They do believe that it should be legal. They're like 100% in agreement on that, which is terrifying. So again, I like to always clarify, even in like one-on-one discussions, and pull people back out of the narrative of, we hear that when we talk about the DR Congo. It was King Leopold who was the villain and who did this, who did that. It's so easy to pin everything on one man, and then when
Sure.
that man is dead or gone or in The Hague or whatever, we're like, he faced the consequences. We all live in a rose world, but I also work on DR Congo as part of my job, and have been to the Congo during the Ebola crisis in 2018. And it's one of the world's richest places in natural resources. They literally don't need anyone if they are allowed to use their own resources. But there is this global capitalistic greed in what their land has to offer. And then we keep going back to what Belgium did, what King Leopold did, blah, blah, blah. But again, what are we doing now to change that? Not enough,
Yeah.
obviously. So,
And domestically too. I mean, the amount of money stolen by Kabila and Mobutu. I mean, there is. I think what's interesting about places like Congo is, yes, there is the for sure colonial legacy that King Leopold and all the Christian
Leopold, sorry, it's
ministries, and I mean, there's so many people that were there that were photos of the Belgian like Christian proselytizing people right next to the people that had their hands chopped off because they didn't bring enough rubber or whatever the case may be. But
and
you also have
it's the same issue.
domestic.
Yeah, it's the
No, I
same
was gonna say
issue.
you also have domestic leadership though that was
Yeah,
robbing the people
totally.
blind as well, and I
Totally.
think
And
that
and that applies to, I mean, I hate getting into it because then I never stop, but it applies to Mahmoud Abbas. It applies to what's happening under the Palestinian Authority, if you will. I mean, he's an
yeah.
expired president who has not held an election since his presidency expired now nearly 10 years ago, which is just
Right.
outright
And he's very
illegal.
old. He doesn't represent the age, the demographics of
He doesn't
Palestinians
represent
versus,
anyone.
yeah,
Yeah, like not one Palestinian I know, or my family who lives there. No one really is in agreement, and no one
yeah,
supports him, and no one approves of him. But he is furthering the Israeli agenda. He is letting the settlements, the illegal settlements, go up like rampant without any shape or form of defense or resistance to that, and
yeah.
even condemnation. At most, he might say one word of condemnation every few months, and it's just so hollow and meaningless. Which brings us also to the issue of Israeli settlements, which we were talking earlier about how they're very open about what they're doing and about their agendas and about their actions and plans. And in 2025, the number of Israeli settlements that were built up and the land that was annexed is the highest it has been since
Yeah.
1967, when the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, and parts of, I think, southern Lebanon, although more of that came later, and Sinai at the time came into place. So we're talking about a historic, monumental, turning point here that
Yep.
sadly is not even getting any or generating any of the rage and reaction and disapproval from the world as it should. And
And it's amazing because you think about it, like with so much attention on Gaza, and negative press and everything else, in one narrative version, you would think Israel would try to like pull back on the settlements because like couldn't use any more bad press. On the other side, what they've chosen to do is it's like a shell game. You're
Keep going.
focusing on Gaza, so let's expand the West Bank. Nobody's going to be even be paying attention.
But the main problem here is impunity.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like let's mess around and find out. So when they
Yeah,
bombed the first hospital and killed around 500 people 2 years ago, early on in the genocide, we were all horrified by it. I remember that night. I cried my eyes out for hours. I was in a catatonic phase for the following few days. But it's just absurd how and I'm using the word absurd a lot today because there are so many
yeah,
things that
yeah.
are just hard to fathom. But Israel went within the span of 1 week to 10 days from saying, we didn't bomb the hospital, it was a rocket that Hamas bombed, which we all know was not right. Like it was so obvious that Israel did it, all the way to not even denying and continuing to bomb hospitals and use that as an excuse of like, human shields and Hamas bases underneath, etc. Which again, like you live in the United States, so many mass shootings happen sadly every day, and
Yeah.
one shooting is already too many. But yeah, a lot more than one happen in the United States every single day, and we know that a lot of them happen in schools. Would it make sense for a SWAT team to come,
No.
and because there's a terrorist, an armed person hiding in that school where there are kids and teachers and would it make sense for a SWAT team to just shoot the school down or bomb it or whatever because there is one bad person hiding in it and kill all these kids? Of course not.
No.
Like it's not even a conceivable idea. So why is it okay for Israel to do it under the
What
pretext?
terrifies me is, in some ways, I feel like that narrative initially started with, well, Hamas was hiding there, blah 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 blah, whatever. But it's gotten, depending on the circle that you swim in, like there are certain people that have pushed back a lot on that now. But then
Yeah,
if you look at what the U.S. is doing in the Caribbean, obviously at a much smaller scale, but they're blowing up boats. To your point, using like SWAT analogy, we wouldn't tolerate SWAT or police or anybody walking around our streets and being like, "Oh, you're dealing drugs," and then just executing them on the street. Yet people are supporting blowing up boats in the Caribbean because supposedly, which we don't even know for sure, they're carrying drugs, which is not an existential threat. Like it's just so many layers. But I'll
yeah,
also say, and I think this is what has also angered me so much is like even even if you could be so callous to figure out a way to justify some of the horrible, horrible genocidal acts across Gaza over the years and in the West Bank, etc., because it's not a people, whatever. Shireen Abu Akleh and other people like this who are Palestinian Americans that
yeah,
are either held in detention or killed
yeah.
and then still no consequences. Like I cannot
No.
imagine another situation where a U.S. journalist could be somewhere, be shot by the forces, the military, sniper, clear as day, and then be like, yeah, well, we're just gonna let Russia investigate, and whatever they come up with, we'll agree with. I mean, it's just crazy,
And
and
it
this
was a straight
narrative.
shot to the ear underneath where the helmet was. Like it was very, very oddly specific. And they
Yeah.
tried they tried all kinds of lies and narratives, like it was by mistake. You can't be that precise by mistake.
Well,
Like
at first they said it wasn't even them. Like
no,
for
yeah,
months
yeah,
and months and
exactly.
months.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then at the same time you know of course the infamous and then this takes us back to the story of the hostages. Ida and Alexander, that I don't even know if the term hostages applies, but the majority of them, the ones that were kept longer especially, were active Israeli soldiers who had killed, like had blood on their hands, had innocent Palestinian blood on their hands, but then the US doesn't care. And then just yesterday, he was in a press conference where he said, and he is an American citizen as well as an Israeli citizen. He said, I am ready to go back and fight for Israel's freedom. And he announced that he's rejoining the army after having been freed, after being captured for more than, I don't know, a year and a half until he
Yeah.
was freed, with like Trump boasting his peace support and mediation and whatnot. Like, what is peaceful about an American citizen coming out to say openly in plain daylight that, after having been captured and having been held hostage or whatever for months and months, for over a year and a half, I'm going back to put myself in the same position and to continue to kill people and contribute to this genocide. So it's the double standards are very flagrant. I do want to address one other question you asked, which is,
Yeah, then maybe we could wrap up with whatever you're going to say.
in terms of what you were saying about, the way forward and the solution. If you survey Palestinians, the vast majority, if not all Palestinians, will tell you, we want an end to all of this and we want to just live peacefully. There are projects out there. I was part of this awards ceremony here in Canada a few weeks ago with my organization's executive director, and one of the winners, one of the finalists, was this group, Israeli-Palestinian group called the name now escapes me, but basically I want to say No Other Land. I think it's One Land for All, and the idea of it is to have sort of like a confederacy or a confederacy where, whether you're a Palestinian or an Israeli citizen, you have equal rights, you have access to the same opportunities, same passport, same this, same that, but then, and you can reside on whatever piece of the land. And I assure you, Palestinians would be more than happy with that. Obviously, we have been suffering for generations and generations. And again, it goes back to my own personal generational trauma. I would love to see that happen. And the problem, I assure you, is not with the Palestinians. It's with a lot of the Israeli settlers, because what does that mean is, you want to open the land to everyone, and that will immediately create an imbalance from the Israeli Zionist dream perspective, where the Jewish people will suddenly be a minority versus Palestinian Muslims and Christians. And it will take Palestine back to pre-48, where it was a very diverse society of people from all walks of life, all backgrounds. And I mean, just a note here, and I would love for people to look it up. There's the Sumerians in Nablus, who are arguably the oldest continuously living Jewish sect in the world, and they have been part of that land forever. They've never left, and they identify as Palestinian. They don't identify as Israeli, and the Israeli government hates them and considers them the wrong Jews, which is just, again, such an absurd and false notion. So what I tell people usually in response to this is, just to begin talking about peace and a way forward, Israel will need to lift the blockade on Gaza, contribute to rebuilding Gaza, and pay reparations for everything they have done there. Give up their dreams of expansion in East Jerusalem. Give back East Jerusalem. Pull out of the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque and the entire area of East Jerusalem. And dismantle all their settlements, their illegal settlements in the West Bank, which, again, if we go back to the settlements in Gaza pre-2005 and how they all were taken down in no time, it's not impossible to do that. Or maybe give up some of that, those houses and those nicely built neighborhoods to Palestinians whose lands you stole and appropriated illegally. Would Israel say yes to that? Absolutely not. Not in a million years. So that is where the problem lies. And that is, I think, the path forward. We need to focus on visualizing and thinking collectively. How can we actually accomplish that?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think I mentioned this to you before, but I made a video kind of reacting to Pete Buttigieg talking about the situation. It was a wider conversation, but he was talking about this, and specifically the conversation about equal rights and having a state where everybody has the same equal rights, the same freedoms, the same, judicial systems, etc. And I forget the person's name, Dean Winters, I think, was the person interviewing him, and basically was saying, we want that in America. We want a pluralistic society. We want equal rights. We want all these things here. Why wouldn't you want that everywhere, right? Like what? And then Pete's basic response was, well, I know what's good for America, but it might not be. We've had problems where we try to impose things, kind of try to pull in like the Iraq War and other things. And it's just it's an insane argument to basically say we believe in equal human rights, basic freedoms, etc., for
For
everyone
ourselves, but
except
not for
for,
everyone.
well,
Yeah,
and not even that, but in other places. We advocate for these things in many places around the world, but in the land that we call Israel, we don't want that specifically because, as you said, if there was the right of return, if there was all these things, then Palestinians would, outnumber Israelis, and then, you would no longer have a Jewish state. But we don't want religious states in other places either. We want
exactly.
secularism. And so I think there's this interesting narrative
And as a Muslim,
where,
I promise you, I never want an Islamic state. I never want
right,
a Muslim supremacy state. I don't think, even as a Muslim, that would work at all to my benefit. You were mentioning, I mean, the Bondi attack happened, which was horrific, but sadly, the same day or the day after, you see Israelis in Gaza using the rubble to build a big menorah and celebrating Hanukkah, again, like symbolizing that using the rubble of the houses they destroyed. And if I were Jewish, and I'm sure that you agree, I would be horrified when I see that you're using my identity, you're using my religion to justify your crimes, and that puts a target on me, and that vilifies me, even though I have nothing to do with any of this.
yeah. Yeah, and I think it's just it's a crazy thing because I guess the next jump from we don't want this to happen where everybody has equal rights because then you lose the, Jewish state is really then we're arguing for apartheid. Or really then we're arguing for unequal treatment. And then people don't want to argue that, people don't want to admit that, but there's only two choices there really.
Totally.
And it's a wild place to be, especially when you think about all these other arguments like we were saying where we do advocate for democracy and secularism and basic rights and freedoms and equality and all these things pretty much everywhere else in the world, including here at home. So I hope one day we can get to that place where, and I mentioned this to you before, where like the intergenerational trauma of Palestinians since 40 and before, and the intergenerational trauma of Jews around the world from pogroms to the Holocaust to others, and the acceptance that people need to be able to have the same basic rights, freedoms, dignity, etc., no matter who you are, wherever you are. That's like the only way forward.
100%.
And like there needs to be because I think what's fascinating too is you were talking about kinship and things amongst the Arab world and like there's differences and whatever. Like there's a lot in common between Jewish people and Palestinians too, and like the cultural like
100%.
things. Like I mean, there's so many things that we're much more alike than we're different.
Yeah,
Not just those two people, but like the world, right? Like the average
totally.
human to human.
Totally. Totally.
And if we could just get out of our own way and get some of these extremists and failing leaders, like you're
Good
saying
ending
about
to the book.
Abbas, like maybe there's a way forward.
Yeah, and it's important to always remember that if you look at it from a bird's eye view, there are so many, like there are more than enough resources in the world for everyone to
For
live.
sure.
There's enough food, enough land. Only 3 or a little over 3% of the world's land mass is inhabited, which is insane when you think about it.
Yeah.
But there's all these deserts and tundras, etc. So there's really enough resources for all of us, and it's important to keep that in mind because, like you said, if like violence breeds violence, and no one's peace will be achieved on the oppression and persecution of someone else.
100%. I think that's a great way to end. Thank you so much. Obviously, we could keep talking forever, and maybe we'll
Totally.
do another part two or something.
Happy to.
But really great talking with you, and yeah, thanks for watching.
Thank you so much, Mike, and yeah, thanks for everyone watching. Take care.